Today, on the pale threshold, better an old demon than a new god. Pareidolia of allegory related to historical events and religious context. History does not exist in a vacuum. Record keeping is very important. One of the first things that gets lost as the historical record and archaeological record dissipates over time is the context and intention behind the original events. The mind will fill in details where they are not available and ascribe significance to things based on one's own perceptions. This is the pareidolia of allegory which occurs in historical context. One thing taking away from the accountability of historical records is this pareidolia. It's much better to leave things open-ended than to fill in details where one is unsure or the historical record is unclear. Even contemporaneous accounts can be flawed. Herodotus was basically the Rick Steves Travels Europe of his time. Whenever he would encounter new situations, new people, he did his best to record what it was he was seeing. But he didn't always know exactly why people were doing the things they were doing, or the overall cultural significance of what he was encountering. Thus, his records are deeply flawed. It's good that we do have Herodotus's history, but it cannot be taken alone as a full historical account, especially in the modern era where more information is available. Allegory and archetypes are very easy to ascribe to historical events. You have the work of Joseph Campbell, in which he lays out all of these archetypes. People, especially in the modern digital age, where everything is now available online, are trying to make icons of themselves, trying to be put on a pedestal. The cult of celebrity has kind of reached its tipping point in this particular time. But it's important to be able to separate the legend from the individual and see the well-rounded person behind that celebrity. It can perpetuate a culture in which people are above reproach and above the law, which can be harmful overall. I'm going to shift gears now into deity worship and historical precedents. It's important to have that proper historical context when approaching devotional practice and, by extension, magical practice. A lot of the roots for modern esoteric thought and philosophy were planted rather recently, within the past 150 years or so. In the early 20th century, you had people like Crowley, Blavatsky, Manly P. Hall, and others who were reviving ancient ideas under the umbrella of Hermeticism and these new religious orders. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, Astra Argentum, OTO, Theosophical Society. There was also, at this time, a big Egyptology boom. So a lot of new archaeological evidence coming to the forefront and being uncovered and introduced to modern audiences. However, these records were still incomplete. So even though a lot of information had been uncovered, there was still a lot that needed to be translated and a lot of historical sites that had not yet been uncovered. The main archaeological discovery during this time period being the nearly complete tomb of Tutankhamun. To give a little historical context, the reason Tutankhamun's tomb was so well preserved was that his father was a heretic who had created a monotheistic religion worshipping the Ophin disk, basically just the sun disk in the sky. What happened was this wrestled control away from the priests of Amun. So when Tutankhamun, the boy king, came into power and restored the polytheistic religious structure, the priests of Amun were very invested in his being remembered for eternity. Back to the early 20th century. This was a period of time when publishing books about esoteric concepts was a very good and lucrative way to make a living. Thus, it was in the best interest of these esotericists to be as verbose as possible about these subjects, to fill in details where details were not necessarily available. This comes into a lot of channeled information. Channeling can be a very useful and effective tool in finding out things about the world around you, especially if you have highly attuned your psychic capabilities. However, that information, by its nature, is going to be flawed, and it's necessary to fact check it, documenting everything very well, and then going back and figuring out how much of this can be verified using reliable sources. There was also a lot of artistic license being taken, especially in the artwork field, because when you are creating a beautiful painting, it's basically whatever you want it to be. The symbolism is the most crucial part of esoteric artwork. But again, filling in a lot of these details, some of that historical precedent and context is lost. Not all of the work that came out of this period was bad, and in fact, some of these systems are still very useful, even if not fully historically accurate. However, the biggest disservice done to material during this time was decontextualization and cultural appropriation. So as previously mentioned, we had the Egyptological boom. During this period of time, you have Aleister Crowley and Rose sleeping inside the pyramid and channeling that information. You have other esotericists who are jumping on the Egyptology bandwagon and talking about these entities. You also have Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn's appropriation of the Tree of Life from Kabbalah. This is one of those systems that is very useful in its structure in the context of the Golden Dawn, but which has been highly sanitized of Jewish religious context in the context that it's used in Golden Dawn, which is truly a disservice. In order to properly study Kabbalah, by my own estimation, as an outsider, one must have extensive understanding of Hebrew and of Jewish religious texts. That is why, in previous times, a boundary was set that one must be 40 years old before commencing study of Kabbalah. That's just been my experience, though. Please let me know if yours is different. The Egyptian religious practices and Kabbalah also have their roots in ancient Sumerian and Babylonian religious practices. And those, I think, have kind of fallen by the wayside. There is a lot of cuneiform documentation of different religious practices. Now we have much more information about Inanna, who was a major Sumerian deity, and how Inanna has transformed through different systems is something I have tracked and studied. But the effect was that a lot of these things started in that Sumeria, Babylon region, and then disseminated throughout the Middle East. So then in the 60s and 70s, you have the New Age spiritual movement starting. A lot of this was based in things like transcendental meditation. There was a much bigger focus on Eastern religions, especially coming out of India. And you have people doing things more based on feel and the vibes. You have a lot of mother goddess worship. You have a lot of conflation of a lot of different energies into that mother goddess energy. There was also the resurgence of ancient solar worship that was particular to the British Islands. So now the Wiccans and pagans celebrate the Wheel of the Year. 4 of those holidays are based around the solstices and the equinoxes. But they filled in about halfway between the solstices and the equinoxes these other holidays. When I studied the Wheel of the Year, I came to find that these holidays are not even necessarily like the most popular or widely celebrated of the ancient holidays. And in fact, you see the entity of Ostara, which dates only back to the 19th century. That doesn't mean that Ostara is not valid, but it's important to understand where these things come from so that you can properly utilize their energies. If you're treating this Germanic goddess from the 19th century as an ancient druidic entity, you're not really going to be able to tap into that energy properly. You may as well just use Jesus at that point, because then you're able to use the whole resurrection and everything that goes along with that. There's also a lot of conflation of unrelated concepts. One thing I'd like to tackle in particular is the conflation of Jesus with a lot of these other entities. The one that really gets my goat the most is when they conflate Jesus with Horus, because those two deities are very dissimilar. Horus has been syncretized with a number of different deities in ancient Egypt to relate specific concepts, but he doesn't really have that much to do with the redemption of mankind. If you want the redemption of mankind, you're looking at something more like the myth of the Eye of Ra decimating half of mankind, and then Thoth brewing a bunch of beer to get her drunk so she'll go to sleep and stop the slaughter. Which is very dissimilar from our ideas today about Jesus and how his sacrifice was meant to take the burden of our own individual sins and basically get rid of it. Additionally, the whole point of having Jesus Christ is that we no longer need these separate entities. Now, there have been situations in Christianity where syncretization with native pantheons has been very effective. So if you look at the Orishas, for example, all of those have been syncretized with Catholic saints. And that method of practice is highly effective. It's not something that I personally do, so I invite you to look into it on your own. But it's something that has been utilized in a very effective way by practitioners. And that gets us into the final part of this podcast today, which is chaos magic and being able to create and erect your own entities for worship and practice. You could use your birthday as a sacred holiday. Maybe there are landmarks in your own history that have a lot more meaning than these landmarks which were set forth by our predecessors. Maybe you have ancestral dates. This is the date that my particular branch of the family ended up in this particular place where we live. Those things will mean so much more to you and have the potential to be tapped into energetically in a much more powerful way than some arbitrary thing that you run across in a history or a mythological text. It's better to know the historical context of pre-existing entities and be able to work within that particular system than to try to invent things for these gods. Otherwise, just make up your own system. I'm not going to go into the Doctor Who fandom and write about how the Ninth Doctor is a narco-capitalist. And it's not that no one's allowed to write new scriptures for these old gods, but it really has to be within a specific framework. And honestly, it's better if it comes from within that system and not from outsiders who don't really understand the full context. Isis was a deity widely adopted by the Greeks. In the Hellenistic period of Egypt, there were a lot of syncretizations that occurred that were very effective, but the Greeks were living in Egypt at the time. You have the deity of Serapis, which was the Apis bull and a few other entities kind of combined all together into this one masculine deity. And that was a very effective cult. Ancient deities can hold more collective power in that more people know about them, so there's more of that collective energy going into a particular egregore. But that doesn't mean that you can't create new entities. We have Church of the Subgenius and Bob. You've got the Flying Spaghetti Monster. Even in Discordianism, they have co-opted the goddess of Eris, but her lexicon from ancient times is not very large, and their intention has remained quite true to her original concept. So, these are just some things to keep in mind as you enter your own practice. My name is Verge Bliss. Thank you for joining me today. And until next time, never fear the pale threshold.
Today on the Pale Threshold, right and wrong are black and white, but discernment is in Technicolor. Credibility in the digital age. First, I'd like to look at the components of speaking with authority. We have things like your public image, credentials. Without the right image, though, your credentials might be ignored. Image has to do with your age, your level of attractiveness. Sometimes being too pretty can actually work against your favor in this regard. How you're dressed. Is the way that you dress appropriate to the topic on which you claim to be an expert? In digital spaces, there are other criteria as well. Can you create a convincing graph in Microsoft Excel? How do you properly source your information from reliable sources? Do you have compelling infographics? And most importantly, are you up to date on your meme propaganda? Nepotism also can play a role in building or destroying your credibility. Are your parents known for something in particular? And if they are, does that go counter to what you're known for? There's also narcissism and credibility. So narcissists notoriously are able to manipulate people's perceptions of them. We're also looking at a topic that I'm kind of squeezing in here because it's related to these other issues. And I'll talk more about it in my next episode as well, which is collective surveillance and internet culture. We are exposing ourselves in the most intimate details of our lives through social media. No one gets a full and well-rounded estimation of our lived experience. Therefore, any opinions that are based purely on your social media presence are subject to fallacy. Not everyone is going to love you the minute they meet you. Many people only see how others can be useful to them and will seek out information, videos, music, or other things you post online to copy, rip off, or otherwise co-opt for their own gain. Others who dislike you will fall into cognitive biases, reinforcing opinions of your character based on what you post. Worst, those who wish to actively harm you may gain sensitive information, allowing them to track your location and regular hangouts. Even positively skewed information, if false, only serves to create confusion and should also be avoided. So let's talk now about controlling one's image. This is where you go, what you do, how you dress, and it also has to do with your group of peers. These people define your context not just by the things they say about you, but the content of their own character. Who are you associating with and why? Controlling one's online presence has to do with curating an image. It's usually not a very accurate depiction of somebody's life overall, and it can change a lot across different social media platforms. Somebody might have a neo-Nazi troll account on Twitter X, but also have their normal super liberal Tumblr account. And I also want to mention briefly here, filming strangers for clout on TikTok. There are a lot of feelings of entitlement in regards to the agency and energy of the people around us. Only a few platforms foster genuine interaction and relationships between users, and those are the ones that are modeled more like 90s chat rooms and forums. Even so, people are able to misrepresent themselves on here. So that would be things like the Fediverse and Discord. Most social media sites foster the illusion of connection while only providing superficial human interaction. Instead of interacting with other people in a genuine way, you're actually only interacting with the engagement algorithms of that platform and the advertising. This reinforces parts of mental stimulation having to do with social relationships, our reward centers, and it forms this parasocial bonding between people, which is not a genuine bond. Now we're going to talk about the psychology of OnlyFans, dick pics, and lack of communication perpetuated by image and video saturation. This leads to depersonalization. People don't communicate with others the way they would like to be communicated with in order to actually form a connection with that person. It's possible that they are actually considering the other person's feelings in the interaction, but we've transactionalized sexual encounters while not really talking about or providing people the framework within which to actually communicate with each other. A dick pic should not be the first text that you send to somebody. There should be a lot more communication going on first, probably involving them actually asking you to send that dick pic. How do you spread out polarizing thoughts into proper discernment? So in microbiology, there's something called the dichotomous key. This is a series of questions that are asked about a bacteria. It also involves a series of experiments involving said bacteria. Things like citric acid metabolism. Does it produce indole? All of these questions lead to a definitive answer of what type of bacteria are we looking at here. But it's not just one yes or no question. We need to be participating in this kind of winnowing down process in our own discernment, especially when it comes to these polarizing issues that are being promoted heavily online because they strike a chord within other people and create an emotional response. And I'll talk more in future podcasts about using the emotional mind for discernment rather than the rational mind, and why opinions are actually bad. Thank you so much for joining me today. I would love to know your thoughts. I have my email address available in the bio. If you would like to get in touch with me, it's palethreshold@gmail.com. And until next time, never fear the pale threshold. Today on the Pale Threshold, basic instincts, how polarization of the emotional mind defines our world. We think of modern propaganda techniques as dating back to the early mid-20th century and World War II, when there was an intense propaganda machinery pushing for certain outcomes during that war. There was a lot of polarization between the axis of evil and the Allies, and this was very easily tapped into by the propaganda war machinery. But propaganda goes back further than that, and this polarizing iconography. You have, dating back very far, the religious iconography, which was used to communicate stories and spiritual concepts through imagery. These were very open to interpretation, they were highly symbolic, and designed to elicit emotional response within the viewer. Few people could read or write, so being able to convey religious doctrines graphically was crucial to spreading religion. And this doesn't just apply to Christianity. Creating polarization to elicit primal emotional responses. This will bypass the rational mind and purely tap into the emotional mind. It drives higher engagement because people are delivering a knee-jerk response. Even if that response is well crafted by the rational mind, it may still be suffering from cognitive biases due to its initial placement in the emotional mind. This is not just fear, anger, or disgust, but it can be also lust, jealousy, or impulsive shopping behaviors that are influenced by this. Knee-jerk emotional responses also often don't take the target audience into account or cast the audience in a negative light. Saying something just to get an emotional response out of that person rather than actually trying to convince them of your point of view. It's not a refined form of discourse, but rather, if your only tool is a sledgehammer, every problem looks like a cinder block wall. There's a deference to credibility. So if somebody is seen as highly credible, they may have their statements taken purely at face value, when every piece of information you plan to repeat as fact should still be sourced as thoroughly as possible. Their statement can serve as a jumping-off point, but you should be doing further research. This also goes into the realm of opinion. Opinions being taken as evidence for or against something can be very dangerous to the state of society. People are using their polarized emotional minds to craft opinions not based on their actual values. So an example of this would be when people wish harm on a particular group of people, but if you ask them their values, they say, "I believe we should love others as we love ourselves," which clearly through their other actions is proven not to be the case. And it would be better if they weren't going against their core values. Can the intentions of the emotional mind leak into psychic spaces? So, some of you may or may not believe in psychic phenomena, but I think there's a lot to explore in how our ability to take in subtle information about the world around us can cross over into what looks like psychic phenomena. So I hope that you'll bear with me if you're one of those people who doesn't necessarily believe in psychic powers. People do have levels of sensitivity to the energetic fields of others. For example, there are other people who can do this too, but people who have been in traumatic situations are often much better at gauging what another person's emotional state might be because they had to figure out when X, Y, or Z person was angry or about to lash out at them. Likewise, you have types of autism that interfere with your ability to gauge what another person's emotional state is at a given time. The ways we speak about others. So, if you handle this in the wrong way, obviously it can be harmful. But what is our obligation to that other person? What is our responsibility to that other person? What even is our involvement with that other person? If you shouldn't be involved with that other person, and you wouldn't be involved with them otherwise, maybe it's better to just leave it at that. Because overall, what potential effect could it have? One final thought I would like for you to think about. If you knew that your bad mood had the potential to kill somebody, how would you handle your irritation differently? Thank you for joining me today. I am so grateful for all of you who have been tuning in. If you would like to give me your thoughts, my email address, which is also in the bio, is palethreshold@gmail.com. That's the Instagram as well. And until next time, never fear the pale threshold.